I need to become an ideologue. I am absolutely sick of nuance, of rational thinking, of seeing the other perspective, of weighing up all the probabilities, of taking the big picture and seeing that things are complicated. I'm done. I'm finished. I don't want it anymore. I want ideology. I want to become possessed. I want to become a religiously fanatic Muslim. I want to become a far right extremist. I want to become a radical communist. Anything. Just give me something. Hand me a book and say, this is all that there is. Everything else is false. You can destroy the people who do not believe this book. Yes, I made it up. It's completely just something I just pulled out of my imagination. But take it. It's the truth. It will empower you. You don't need to think anymore. There's no more thinking. There's no more hesitation. There's no more nuance. There's no more listening to someone else. You can just go Puritan mode. Puritan mode, you can just burn people. You can just go crazy and demand that they yield to your vision and your will, even if it's wrong. You could actually it is wrong. The whole point of it is that it's wrong, and that because it's absurd and wrong, you force it upon the world anyway. It's all about just the sheer power of your will, taking something that is wrong, ideologically wrong, and making it happen anyway. And you're free. Here you go. Here it is. Just go do it. I need that. I need to be let free. I'm going crazy. I can't think anymore. I can't abstract. I can't rationalize. It's all cope. All thinking is cope. I just need to be let out. I'm like a horse preparing for a race, and people are like bashing me with books, getting me all hyped up, and I'm at frenzy pace now. And I just need someone to open that door and let me go, bolt, let me run, let me go and run. And the problem I am having is that the person that I'm going to decide to be ideologically obsessed with, I'm going to decide to go totalitarian, I'm going to decide to go Puritan. I'm stuck between two Germans. One is a incel who lived on the mountain, who hated his Germanism and renounced it, and the other is a Swiss German who went mad and schizophrenic and banged his patients. I need to choose between one of these strange esoteric extremists, both of them basically like suffering from some type of schizophrenia. I need to choose one of those to become my dogma so that I can then impose it upon the world, so I can then relieve myself of nogginism, of conceptualizing, of abstract thought entirely, and just simply live, just simply repeat words that I don't even care to understand, I don't even want to explore. I just want to be given something like that. And so my challenge is deciding, do I go with Jung or do I go with Nietzsche? Who do I pick? Who is better? Who is correct? Who can I ideologically invest all my Bitcoin in? Who can I go fully in? Who can I buy fully into and forget everything else and hate everything else and turn around to everything else and call it wrong and have a religious war against everything else, a holy jihad, a crusade against anything that is not what I believe and what I see, what I understand. So today we're going to finally settle it. We're going to pit Nietzsche against Jung and then settle once and for all who we shall become ideologues for. This is it. The final Titan fight. Now, it's quite a difficult choice to figure out how we can distill down to some type of way of judging which of these two is better, because in some sense both of them are absolutely nuts. Nietzsche literally went insane and had his diaper changed by his sister who he hated for the rest of his life. And so it's kind of hard to kind of find in all this crazy stuff that was coming out of him, his actual insanity and all this, like what's something that we can hold on to that's firm and that we can judge. Jung is not much better. Like Jung literally saw things. He literally used to walk around and have voices talking to him, and he'd like see things. He'd actually hallucinate, That's the type of stuff where you end up in a mental asylum nowadays. Jung was crazy too. These two guys were nuts. These two guys were schizophrenic. So they're the perfect person for us to base a revelatory ideology upon. This is just exactly what we're looking for. But the problem with this is that it's all kind of like, it's a bit kind of out there. It's a bit kind of floozy and crazy. And so we have to try to distill it down to something axiomatic. Before I discard abstract thought and philosophical thinking, I'm actually going to use it in order to liberate myself. This will be the final use of philosophy. So what I'm going to do is chew through all of this madness and nonsense and blather that comes out of these two lads, and I'm going to distill it down to the axiomatic principles that maybe we can then judge and establish a way of making sense of these type of guys. So for example, the central thing that I think they share, the thing that Nietzsche and Jung both talk about extensively, is you could say the idea of what we understand. Well, we don't understand it. Most modern people just cope. They don't understand anything. What we call the unconscious, or maybe the subconscious. You might have heard this on the self-help community, you hear it in the law of attraction community, they sort of suggest to you, it's like, all right, you have this, your subconscious mind is a supercomputer. You often hear this, a supercomputer that's hidden from your conscious mind. And if you go to sleep at night and you do affirmations where you say, I am the best, I am the best, I am a boyo, I'm the boyo, I'm the boyo, I'm the Ubermensch, I'm the best. If you say that all night, you repeat these affirmations to yourself, it's like you're coding the computer. It's like you're speaking to the subconscious mind, and it learns this stuff, and then it sort of changes your whole reality. It does all this amazing stuff where it changes, like auto-suggestion or something like this. And what's very interesting about that is that implicit idea, it's actually quite a radical idea. People didn't really think like that in the past. But of course, it's saying that there's this force inside your head, this inside of you, inside of your mind. There's something that is not, you could say, really readily accessible. It's not like your conscious walking around blatherbraining self-talking mind. In fact, that's how could we model it? That's a little tool that shows up every single day when you wake up, and it does all its work, and that's sort of actually what you understand is you. But there's it's almost like behind the scenes, behind that, there's this big powerful machine, big powerful force, the subconscious, this supercomputer that actually helps this along. This is of course where dreams come from. When you think about your thoughts, for example, like your thoughts you don't just think things, you don't just sit there and go voila, you don't think things. It's almost like there's a hole in the back of your head, like in a cinema. There's like this guy holding a camera, and all the thoughts kind of flow in. They flow in in front of your eyes, in front of your mind's eye, and you see them, and then they might drift away, and then new thoughts will come in. And it's kind of strange when you think about it. Like, you don't know where they come from. They come from somewhere else inside of your head, the back of your mind, as we often say, the subconscious, the unconscious, the supermind, the other mind, whatever you want to think about it. Now, this big idea, this is really the sort of anchoring of these two gentlemen, because of course Nietzsche was one of the very first people to really start to hammer on this idea that we have some type of operant force inside of our mind that is, shall we say, a little bit separate than our what we call now our ego, or our awareness, or our conscious mind. And it's a hard thing to kind of figure out, because I think really what Nietzsche did that's so shocking, and what Freud and Jung afterwards kind of brought on board as well, is that Nietzsche was able to really drill on the idea that our conscious mind can be full of unmitigated cope. Like, our conscious mind can just be all blatherbrain nonsense. We can tell ourselves the most stupidest ideas ever, and rationalize and make up crap that is complete delusion, and be driven entirely by the supercomputer. The supercomputer can be driving things behind the scenes, and we can somehow coherently just live our lives and think consciously that we're doing something, when really in truth there's something else going on. The simplest example of this that he gives quite a lot is discussing about you could say the preachers of equality. So you can think about you're a poor Russian guy in 19th century Russia, and you've got these urges, these passions, and these urges, they're sort of blended in with your subconscious. They're not kind of there all the time. Think about when you're walking down the street, you're not really like that aroused, but then you see a beautiful girl, or you go on Instagram, see a beautiful girl, and then your arousal, the god of arousal, lust, just shoots up into your consciousness. It shoots up and bullies your head out of the way, and bullies your ego out of the way, and says, do this now. And it's almost like out of the supercomputer, an application just turned on. You're like, whoa, I'm kind of switched on now. I've got to do this. Something like this is going on. So that's all hidden in the computer, in the hard drive of the computer, the unused RAM of the computer, this type of thing. And so Nietzsche noticed that whatever goes on in this computer, whatever goes on in this subconscious, it's one of the driving forces of our thinking. And so what happens is you're sitting there and you're broke, and you've got these passions. You want to be high status. You want to be high status and powerful and cool so that you get all the girls. And you're not, because you're broke. You're a poor peasant, if you will. And you see these aristocrats. You see these rich aristocrats like the Tsars, and they have all these beautiful stylish clothes, and they've got all these beautiful girlfriends, and they're riding around, and they've got this prestige and all this type of stuff. And deep down inside of you, you feel envious. You feel angry. And you can think about it. It's like, what the fuck have you done to earn your position in society? I'm the one who works. You just kind of hang around and wear nice clothes and make and think about stuff. Like, what's going on here? I don't really see why you should have all that status and I shouldn't. and the envy begins to drive inside of it. But of course, we can't be honest with ourselves, because we have a kind of difficulty being transparent with what we actually feel. We can't be honest with ourselves and say, you know what, I'm envious of that guy, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kill him and take his stuff. This would be a very transparent, natural way to kind of think of this, like the way maybe a lion or an ancient barbarian would have thought. I'm just going to kill you and take your stuff because I want to, because I want your stuff. And it's like, oh, fuck, all right. Oh, shit, please don't. And he's like, no, that's what I want. Conan the Barbarian kind of speaking. But instead, and we can't do that anymore. We've modernized. We've flattered our conscious mind. And so what has to happen is we would never really consider that evil and wrong, you know? So what we have to do is we have to kind of paint a story for ourselves. We have to say to ourselves, it's not that I am angry and envious of the aristocrat. It's not that I want to barbarically just take their stuff. In fact, I am a very moral and good person. I've actually built this ideology. This ideology is an ideology of equality. I heard it off a guy called Karl Marx, and it's a beautiful idea. It's the idea that, you know, if we just got rid of this aristocrat, of these people in these fancy clothes, and we established a society of utopian equality, and we got everybody to join this beautiful big idea. If we just got rid of those elitist pricks, and maybe we'd have to kill them just for symbolic sake or something like that, we would have, everything would be beautiful, and we would do something that's fair and equal and nice. And it's not to do with my resentment. Like that's not don't get it twisted. I'm not resentful. I'm actually moral. I'm actually a good person. I'm actually a crusader. I'm on a holy jihad, a Puritan ideological journey. And that's absolutely fascinating, because what that is sort of saying is that the resentment is driving the thing. But of course, all this nonsense and cope and the kind of problems with the way we understand ourselves kind of fuck with our heads quite a lot. And so we can't actually interpret, we can't be honest with what we want to do. We can't say, oh, like a barbarian, I want to take his stuff. We can't say that. So we have to make up a beautiful lie such as the Marxist utopia, or whatever it is. The French Revolution had modern liberal values, all this type of stuff. People always come up with lies. Lies always happen in this type of way. And I call this nogginism. I call this the intellectualized, rationalized cope. And of course, science has come around and proven this pretty sufficiently correct. The left hemisphere can literally just make up the most delusional crap ever. That's the linguistic processing part of your mind that's actually quite conscious more than everything else. And it can just make up a big story, a big nonsense story. And you do this in all sorts of ways all throughout your life. You see a beautiful girl and you have desires for her, but you're actually afraid of confronting her. And so instead of you saying to yourself, I'm a coward, I'm afraid of talking to the beautiful girls because I don't feel like I'm good enough, because I haven't worked hard enough in my life to build myself into a Chad. Instead of you being honest with yourself and hurting your feelings, you instead say, oh, she's a slut, she's a whore, she's less than me, I'm better than her, or something like this, something along these lines. You make a cope, you make it some type of idea and belief about it. It's the same with, for example, guys and their girlfriends, not girlfriends as in sexual, but like platonic friendships, you know? Like there's a guy who says, oh yeah, I just want to be your friend, I just want to hang out with you. And the girl kind of thinks, all right, cool, he's being nice to me and all this. And he hangs out and he hangs around her. But deep down, he actually has feelings for her. And then, of course, the girl's friends will say, hey, text him one night, late at night, and just as a test, and say, hey, I'm super drunk and horny. Do you want to meet up and hook up? And then she does this, and he says, yeah, sure, yeah, straight away, let's go. And she's like, what the fuck? And it's like, well, you know, deep down, the secret intentions were always there, and you only need to give them space to show up when the kind of rubber hits the road. You need to give it that moment to show up, and then boom, it leaps out and it shows itself. The application, lust, the God pops up. The secret subconscious drive and desire pops up and does this. And so all this beautiful story about platonic friendship and me and you together and I love you for your personality and all this type of stuff, it all gets brushed aside. That's just a sort of nice civilized tool for delusion and coping in order to just get things running along smoothly until the opportunity happens. It's the exact same dynamic when it was like in Russia, you know, equality, beauty, like end of the world, peace, non-violence, utopia, all this type of stuff. And then these Bolsheviks, they seize power, and the second they seize power, it's like the girl saying, I'm horny, I'm drunk. The second they seize power, the aggression and the envy shoots up. And the family, the royal family, the aristocrats, gets murdered, gets butchered. the most brutal, unequal violence of all. The murder of children even involved in this as well. And it happens like that, like in a second. It shoots up. The second the Cope story has gotten them far enough, the monster comes up to play and actually does its work. And Nietzsche was an acute student of this. He could see, he called himself the first psychologist. He could see deep down these secret desires operant. And he studied this supercomputer inside of our bodies and said, that supercomputer, that there's something going on there. There's something going on there that's a pretty big deal. In fact, he sort of says that supercomputer is the driver of the vast majority of our thoughts. And you could take a worldview, what Nietzsche would propose, that looks at the vast majority of our conscious cope and rationalization as delusion, as nonsense, as just whistling past the graveyard, nothing too serious or real. All of Christianity, just a whole big elaborate cope. Because if you try to dig underneath Christianity and see these secret desires, you see a way different story. And you have to be able to think to yourself, all beautiful ideas, all ideas that propose beauty, all things with a beautiful surface often have terrible depths. And this is his sort of critique, not a critique even, but his observation about all this type of stuff. Marxism, the preaching of equality, the French Revolution, Christianity, all these things that sound gorgeous, they weren't necessarily what they seem on the surface. There's a force of unimaginable passion and barbarism driving this stuff still. The passions, the supercomputer, the subconscious has this type of power. And Freud spoke essentially on the same terms. Freud is basically Nietzsche chewed up and digested in a slightly different way, maybe made more suitable for something like psychoanalysis, which is sitting in the chair and studying people. This is the whole idea of psychoanalysis. But then along comes Jung, and Jung and Freud have a bit of a head clash, which leads to a whole different way of seeing things, and a slight deviation, which allows us to maybe start to pit these two beasts against each other. Now, what Jung begins to notice, or maybe he begins to stress, is that this supercomputer and this ego, they actually talk in quite a profound, it's almost like they have separate languages. Freud noticed this a little bit too, but Jung really went into this. You can imagine the unconscious, the subconscious, it speaks in dreams. Dreams are almost like its way of talking. And you think about the language that comes out of dreams. It's not like English or German or French or something like this. It's not broken down into syntax in the way that we understand it. It's not that sort of sharp, you could say, left hemispheric language that we're used to. It's in fact a symbolic language. It's a language of images, of pictures, of collages of colors that are splashing out. The dreams will show us scenes. It's almost like a movie talking to us. And it's trying to speak to us in allegory and metaphor and myth, even, if you will. And Jung starts to run with a pretty profound idea that there's some type of force in this subconscious that is not just this, you could say, these primal, passionate desires. There's something maybe higher than that. He conceptualized it as the soul, the anima, as he called it. And it's this, or maybe even the self underneath it. Nonetheless, it's this sort of supercomputer that's speaking in a way, or maybe a living entity that's speaking in a way, is an intelligence in a way. And actually it's a superior intelligence, possibly with the power to kind of guide you. Now this is a little bit different because Nietzsche and Freud, and they seem to have this, you could say, very reductive thing. It feels when you're reading these guys that the sort of implication is that you have these strong, passionate, driving desires, and then you have this coping, rational ego. And in some sense, these desires are the kind of star of the story, and there's really just a bit of coping rationality that's going on around this. But Jung is saying something very profound in that this supercomputer and this soul that lives inside of there, this intelligent entity that lives inside of there, that speaks in this symbolic language of dreams, that appears in myths and metaphors, is actually a guiding force, is something that's sort of sitting on your shoulder and seeing the world around you and able to interpret the world around you and give you information and give you guidance and teach you things and actually lead you in some type of sense. Your soul can lead you through the world. Now that's a kind of a crazy idea. So he's flipping it on the head, where he's sort of suggesting you can maybe even talk to this supercomputer of yours and kind of move along with it. It's quite a strange thing. Now, What's interesting about that is that it sets up quite a lot of what he began to see as Jungian theory. His whole idea was that when you sit down with a schizophrenic and they begin to talk about their theories, the kind of crazy things that they're seeing, or you read someone's dreams and you see this language that is coming up out of the dreams, it's almost like you could begin to, if you could learn, if you could become a Jungian, a high priest who could learn the language of dreams, you could maybe sit down with someone and read their dreams and see what the soul was trying to say. If you want to maybe understand this in my terms, this whole left hemisphere, right hemisphere, you have the left hemisphere, the conscious, blathering, chatterbraining ego, and then you have the right hemisphere, which talks as well with dreams, talks with symbolic languages. And the right hemisphere sees everything. And so if you kind of brush the ego out of the way and start to talk to the dreams of a person and read the dreams of a person, it's like you're talking directly to the right hemisphere, and you can sort of say, hey, what's up? What's going on? And maybe the right hemisphere shows you a lot of really scary dreams and images. And you might be able to predict from that. Maybe the right hemisphere is trying to say, I'm not in good shape here. Something bad is about to happen soon. It might even show you implications of what this might be. It might suggest patterns of what might be going on. It might show lots of flashes of, insanity or danger or something like this, or breaking down the mythological themes and archetypes of people going insane or people breaking down and stuff like this. And maybe Jung is sitting there reading the dreams of a person, having this dialogue and conversation with the symbolic right hemisphere, under supermind, super conscious and all this, talking to this unconscious. And he can then sort of predict that, oh my God, this person's about to go crazy. This person's about to have a schizophrenic flash. This person's about to go psychotic or something like this. He could maybe read that and see it before the time. And that's a very interesting idea. And so Jung's sort of notion here is that, well, this dialogue between these two things is actually quite profound. And he began to understand then that what actually often needs to happen with something like a psychosis is that, of all things, usually it's a signal that the conscious mind has chosen not to listen to this subconscious, this other mind, this dreaming mind. And the way that it represents itself as passions, intuitions, hunches, feelings, fantasies, dreams, all these type of things, these hidden unconscious drives, if you want. And he finds that maybe where schizophrenia or psychosis happens is often a consequence of people, you could say, denying these unconscious desires, this other mind, this super mind. They're pushing it away. They're saying no to it in a strong sense. And in fact, often what they need to do is they need to completely destroy their ego and learn to calm down and start to listen to this thing, listen to this other thing, and develop a working, functional relationship with it. You could even say a nearly religious relationship with it, where you sort of say, these hunches and these dreams and these ideas and these notions and these fantasies, that's my soul talking to me and all this type of stuff. And this is really difficult for people like Freud, and I'm not even sure if Nietzsche, I'm sure Nietzsche would have struggled with it in some sense, because it seems very kind of like it's just fairly out there. It's like 20 steps ahead, but more than people can kind of think. Now I look at stuff like the right hemisphere nowadays, and I'm sort of like, whoa, Jung might have been on the money about the idea of an intelligent, intellectual force inside your brain that's separate from what you understand as normal day-to-day conscious, which is able to talk to you all the time and usually is wired through things like dreams, symbolic languages, and the embodied experience an awful lot more than you, and maybe even talks to you through things like hunches, gut feelings in your chest, body pains, sensations, dreams, and all this type of stuff. And so Jung, through his crazy experiences in his life, sort of began to come up with this thesis that you need to learn to marry to this. You need to learn to connect yourself with this and match yourself with this and find this other force inside your mind and blend yourself together and marry this. And when this is almost something that you have to do. Like, in order to mature as a person, you have to go through this process where eventually you yield your ego, yield your conscious mind, and you connect to your soul. And religions kind of forced you to do this in the past in a way that you wouldn't have really understood. They would have suggested, for example, that you need to surrender your heart to Jesus. Islam would sort of means submission in that sense of like you submit your ego. You wouldn't have understood it at the time, but submit your ego to this higher intelligence, which is sort of represented as Allah. And this is present in religions like Buddhism, the exact same thing. There's this sort of disciplining of the ego and this yielding and letting go and detachment from the ego and allowing of the supremeness of the world to flow in through you and you connect with it. And it's all suggesting this sort of, through religion, suggesting the process of you actually going through this. They're not articulating it in a way that's scientifically coherent, but it's functionally coherent, which is so important. And of course, Jung kind of comes up with a new proposition of like, all right, the Jungian theory is about doing this process. He calls this the process of individuation. You have to allow this sort of frozen, stiff ego of yours to break down and allow it to begin the communication with, maybe we could say, the right hemisphere, the subconscious mind, the unconscious mind, whatever you want to call it, the entire world itself. There's this sort of idea going on inside of it that this is what needs to happen. And this is exactly what happened to him, which is so fascinating, because he was right about all this type of stuff. He was really on the money, as I said, with the science of the hemispheres really kind of stand. They put a solid foundation underneath his feet, even though he's not taking that seriously nowadays. But you look even at what happened with his Red Book, this kind of very, very difficult experience that he went through, and he sees the Red Book as a successful moment for him and actually engaging with this experience. He sees this problem with the Red Book, where the Red Book is this beginning of a process where his ego begins to break down, and this other mind begins to come in dominant in him and begin to talk to him. His soul shows up. The sort of religious experience begins to happen to him. But of course, because he's in a post-Christian world, he's not able to process this religious experience. And so he goes through this terrible, terrible psychotic break where he needs to, it's almost like he needs to invent a new way to experience this. And so he has to figure out for himself, by just going through the experience, what exactly is going on. And he comes up with all these ideas, the anima, the names of all these type of things. He comes up with all these notions and these thoughts in order to do this process, to connect. His ego has to explore the unexplored. Now, the problem with all this is that Jung finds these theses quite demoralizing. Freud and Nietzsche, in some sense, it's almost like they're presenting us as robots. These copers, these nogginists that are walking around with all these big ideas, these nonsense about religion, and it's all just a delusion. It's all just this big cloud of cope and crap and rationalizations, when really what the whole story is that these monstrous driving passions are really what's driving the whole scene and the whole story. And in some sense, we don't have an identity, we don't have a will, we don't have free will, we have none of that type of stuff. We're just driven by these passions. We're almost this entity that is getting pulled along by this, balloons that are tied to a little crazy animal or kid or something like that, and we have no control over this. And everything that we try to make up about this is just cope and nonsense and delusion. And this is incredibly disempowering on some level, incredibly bleak on some level. Free will is just eradicated. The self is just kind of pushed out of the way. It kind of grinds in your gears a little bit and says to you that you're nothing but a barbarian getting driven around and imprisoned by modern society. It's maybe you could say dehumanizing. And Jung doesn't like this. Jung responds against this, and he finds it as an immense struggle. He can't seem to bring himself to say no to religion as a whole. Maybe he's just addicted to cope, but maybe not. Maybe he's got some truth in him. And so he begins to see that this subconscious mind, he begins to explore, and he begins to notice that this subconscious mind, it might have more to it than merely just a animalistic electrical driving force, a will to power that is just driving like a barbarian, like a primal passion. And instead, there might be something more to it simply than that. He begins to notice that this subconscious, through something like dreams, can talk. Now, talk in a way that's intelligent, talk in a way that's far more than simply just like, barbarian passions, but can actually say stuff to you that is, well, you could say, of guiding power. It can speak to you in a way that can help you. It's almost like it's an intelligent force operant in the hidden parts of your mind that can see things about your life and is watching you and for some reason cares about you and can actually help you do things and move forward in certain ways. Now, of course, this sounds like the most out there religious crazy stuff ever, and Freud and Jung have a big argument and they basically break up because of this. Jung kind of goes nuts because he's like, oh my god, who am I now? What's after happening and all this stuff? And then of course Jung doubles down and says, yeah, fuck it, all right, yeah, religion's real, it's all real, it's like, let's go for it, all this type of stuff. And so he says, right, I'm going to go crazy and I'm going to embrace this full mysticism. Like, you're all fuck you, fuck psychoanalysis, I'm going my own way, I'm done with this. And so his sort of thesis, if you will, is really driven on that idea that this subconscious mind, it speaks, it talks, but it talks in a special way. It doesn't talk with process-orientated, linguistic, analytical language of the ego, if you will, the chatterbrain use of concepts. In fact, it talks with the language of dreams. It talks with the language of dreams, which are symbols. It's like a Hollywood writer, when it wants to say something, it makes out a set of scenes and it presents it to the cultures to try to speak to the culture. Of course, it's the feelings and intuitions you have in your body, these hunches and all these type of things. And Jung is sort of saying, if you learn to listen to these things, you develop a relationship with this unconscious intelligence, this self maybe, or this animating soul maybe, whatever you want to call it, and it will guide you through the world. Like the way you say, listen to your gut. What does your gut say? Like if you do stuff like this, it will guide you. Listen to your dreams. What do your dreams say? This will guide you. This will show you something. And of course, this is quite a radical idea, but astoundingly, when you look at modern neuroscience, now that modern neuroscience can allow us to see into the brain, we see quite clearly that we have a division between our two hemispheres. One of the hemispheres is conscious, linguistic orientated, speaks in the way that it uses abstract language, prone to cope and delusion, prone to being trapped in its own little narrow worldview. And of course, there's also this other hemisphere, this right hemisphere, that it seems like it talks in the symbolic language of dreams. It may even be the source of dreams itself. It is more deeply wired to the body and is often connected to things like impulses, hunches, body pain, feelings, all these type of things. It seems like it is this sort of, you could say, subconscious mind, or this intelligence, or maybe some way related to this intelligence that Jung was talking about. Maybe, in fact, he was experiencing this within himself, and then giving his whole Jungian theory was like his painting he put over, his conceptual painting and framework he put over these experiences that he had. Nonetheless, there's credence to this, to the point where Jung is savagely on point, way before he had any scientific grounding to be so, and we have to give him credit for this. There's some big deal here, and it's quite empowering, because then it turns away this sort of idea that we're barbarian, primal animals getting driven around with like coping rational brains just blathering on top of us and whatnot, but instead it turns us into these, you could say, struggling egos that need to develop a, you could say, religious relationship with this other part of our mind and allow us to work with this type of thing. And this will bring a more complete personality in the end. You go through this process of uniting the hemispheres, if you wish, or uniting with your intuitions and your dreams and your imaginative side, if you wish. If you justify that by saying, all right, well, here's a Jungian framework, a theory, you could say the right hemisphere theory, you could say the Jungian theory, doesn't really matter. It will do this sort of goal that actually leads to a good thing happening. Basically, you can think of it like left hemisphere and right hemisphere. These two need to be connected properly in order for them to, in order for your mind to work in its optimal state. And of course, when you are, you don't need to scientifically understand why that's happening. You don't need to know all the neuroscience of this type of stuff. And so, what people often need is some type of ideology to teach them to do this. And this is sort of what religion is. You think about Islam means submission. It's submit the ego, submit the blathering, chattering left hemisphere to this broader, powerful, intelligent force, which is Allah, which of course represents this sort of subconscious, if you will, and teaches you to connect with it, and teaches you how to be coherent. It organizes and puts together and fits out your whole psyche and puts everything into its place and creates a sort of hierarchy within your mind. And true Islam, you understand your primal passion to conquer the world gets spiritualized and redeemed into something we call jihad, which is that you're doing it for Allah. Your will to violence and conquest is done for Allah. Your desires for to have sex and lustfully engage in sex and have loads of girlfriends is spiritualized into, if you are a strong enough warrior for Allah, you'll get rewarded with your harem of wives. These passions that are very pagan and primal, and you could say ugly and animalistic, through this profound religion, you're able to coherently put all of this stuff together, and it adapts it and puts it into a sort of framework that makes sense. Christianity does the exact same thing. The wisdom inside of it is that you surrender your will to Christ, and Christ gives you access to the hierarchy of powers and angels that God possesses, and this orders everything for you and makes sense of yourself for you so that you're able to bring it forward. And Buddhism does the exact same thing. You yield the ego, you yield the blathering, chattering monkey mind in order to gain access to the broader power of the detached detached engagement with the world, and this allows you to order yourself and experience the world in its proper way. You put your ego aside, you calm your left hemisphere down, you get it out of the way, and you allow yourself access to this other power. And of course, Jung's struggle and problem, this is exactly what the Red Book was about, is that we live in the death of God world where you can't think this way. So he goes through a psychosis, Nietzsche goes through a psychosis, and there's no religious architecture, there's no religious framework to help him through that process, where you could say maybe the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are syncing together for their proper sense. There's no place for this to happen. So what has to happen is he has to go insane. And in some sense, his problem, this is what the Red Book is all about, is he has to come up with a new way of interpreting this process, a new way of saying, all right, what am I trying to do here? And he comes up with Jungian theory, Jungian conceptions. This is sort of like his new framework to give people, to try help them through this birthing process, this natural evolutionary process, this part of man where you need to unite these two sides of your mind. You need to, you could say, work with this subconscious mind and develop a relationship with them. So you're not just a coping ego walking around being full of blatherbrain bullshit and a secretly driving unconscious force that's pushing you to do things that you're not aware of. You need to get these two things to marry. And in order for you to do that, you need to learn to listen. You need to learn to calm the ego down and get it to pay attention to this subconscious and actually engage with it properly. So the Red Book is him sort of going through that experience himself and taking the blunt force of this whole experience happening without religion to protect him. And he was experiencing schizophrenia, he was experiencing psychosis. And so he came to sort of believe that schizophrenia and psychosis are a signal of the ego breaking down. And usually what would have happened in the past is that because you had a religious architecture, it would be interpreted as, you become one with God. And if you submit properly, you would unite with God. And if you held on to your ego, what would happen? That would be the devil would get you. Satan would get you. That's why Satan is like Lucifer's egotism. And you hold on stiffly and you don't allow yourself to integrate with the right hemisphere. You stay over in your little left hemisphere. And then what happens is you get stuck there. And of course, what happens is your insanity gets extreme. You basically fracture, break apart, and burst open. And you don't yield. You don't submit like the Islam would say. You don't do that. You go diablos. You go satanic. And you get broken. You get trapped in your ego. And you go crazy and stuck and lost. And this breaks you somehow. And that's a very interesting idea. And this is sort of Jung's, you could say, theory manifesting as this map, this framework, this tool set to help post-God people walk themselves through these massive psychotic breaks. Modern people, postmodern people kind of wrestle their way, feel their way through this new territory of, like you could say, the new wave experience and the deep experience of the mind. It's a very, very profound idea. And so the Red Book is sort of like his raw document about, like, here's how I got through this. And he would sort of propose, because a lot of the Red Book's theses are of submission. There's a lot of language of submission, especially towards his anima. Jung is constantly submitting towards the anima, constantly surrendering and giving in towards the anima and saying, I am ashamed, I give you power, I give power over to you. And he's giving that up, and he's yielding his ego for this type of power. And of course, Jung saw his experience with the Red Book as a success. He actually made it through. He made it through because he knew that he was going psychotic, and he knew it was going to be fucking hard because he was going psychotic. All these bad things were happening, but he made it through. He got to the other side. He integrated his unconscious. He integrated his subconscious, and he made it out the other side and came out complete. And he actually survived, and he actually lived to a ripe old age as a happy man. And that's good for him. Well done. You could even look at him, and he's sort of suggesting, like, I think I did it right. Here's the tools I used in order to do right. And of course, his followers turned that into a coping religion, which is annoying. But nonetheless, he's providing with his framework, suggesting this is what's going on. And he is proposing that Nietzsche got it wrong. This is the reason why Nietzsche went insane, because Nietzsche, you could even look at Nietzsche's books and writings as the outpourings of a schizophrenic about to go through this process, around about the same age as Jung, around about their 40s. Nietzsche's building up towards this process where he's going to have to fracture his mind open, he's going to have to yield his ego and integrate with this unconscious force and actually let himself go through this process and give in and submit, basically. Begin the process of submission. And Nietzsche couldn't do that. Now, Jung would say there's a lot of different reasons. First of all, he hit on this stuff so early that in the 19th century that in some sense you can't expect him to do that, because back then there was just no coherent way of really interpreting what was happening. Nietzsche was maybe a tragic necessary sacrifice. Like, there was no coherent way that Nietzsche could have began to understand what was going on. So he was sort of trapped in the 19th century ego. He was trapped in his head, and he was having having all these crazy thoughts about God is dead, and he was like taking those first couple of steps into this big scary world of like what happens when we no longer believe in God and we don't believe in religion, and we can't interpret these internal psychological processes. And so Jung sort of says you see inside Nietzsche his way, Nietzsche's attempts to try do this is egotism. Nietzsche clutches onto pride, Übermensch, will to power. He kind of gets a bit stiffer, a bit more aggressive. He gets a bit more manly, assertive. It's like, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assert a new set of values. God is dead. We have killed him. I'm going to push forward and turn myself into a god. I'm going to evolve into the new god. I'm going to step up to the plate and I'm going to overcome it. My egotism is going to snap back at this. I'm going to push forward and strive through this and make it happen. I'm going to assert. And Jung saw all this stuff building up, and then he saw these sort of unconscious figures, which is really unusual for the time, pop up, like Zarathustra, this sort of force, like you could even say the prophet Muhammad or Allah, popping up inside of his mind and saying, okay, we've got to walk you through this process because you're about to go through some crazy times, brother. Let's try get you through this process. Zarathustra's almost like his guide in some type of sense, but Nietzsche's just not quite able to. He's not quite able to give in. He has this radical, snapping rejection of Christianity. The Antichrist. The will to power. I will re-evaluate all values. And this, he keeps on pushing. He asserts. And just as he comes on the cusp of his great, great promise, I will write the will to power. I will re-evaluate all values. He writes the Antichrist. He writes his Ecce Homo, a parody of Christ's presentation on the stage before Christ is crucified, and Nietzsche descends into madness. He snaps. His ego can't take it anymore, and he breaks. And then suddenly all these parodies, all this stuff, right in the cusp of his great journey, he fails. It all falls apart. He collapses into a blithering mess. His sister comes in, and some of his last words of lucidness is he says to his mum, Mutter, ich bin dumm. Mum, I am an idiot. I am stupid. Which is very sad when you think about it. And it's the signal of a disaster, signal of someone who's coming across this force of the world and failed. He snapped. He snapped due to depression because he couldn't do what Jung understood. He couldn't yield his ego like all the religions told you to do. He couldn't yield his ego like the Buddhists, like the Muslims, like the Christians. He couldn't submit and push that aside. Instead, he made that center stage. He fell for the devil, if you will. He made that center stage and got in his own way. And instead, what he needed to do is yield, submit to this deeper force, this subconscious, and you could say the intelligence within it. And it's the sort of wellspring of religion, and let that lead him. And that would have saved him. That would have helped him through it. And Jung believed through his Red Book that he achieved that. Jung was going through practically the same problem that Nietzsche was, whereas like he was trying to do this process without a religion to support him. And so Jung felt that he got through it properly and correctly processed this. And so Jung began to see what he was suggesting as the new way. And he proposes and suggests to us all that this is what we need to do. We need to figure out, all of us together, we need to figure out the new way for ourselves. And maybe over time, all of this stuff would consolidate into maybe a new religion or something like this, or a new way of seeing things. We need to learn how to go through this problem and learn how to, the sort of the process is required to maybe bind ourselves to the right hemisphere, or maybe it's something bigger than that. I don't want to be too reductive, but this is fundamentally his thesis, a very, very profound thesis, and there's a lot of stuff that really, really stands by it. And the basic thesis is that Nietzsche is wrong, and we shouldn't listen to Nietzsche because Nietzsche obviously went crazy. Like Nietzsche, he ended up in a diaper, lads. Like he ended up in a fucking nappy. Like what are you listening to? What are you listening to a man talking about will to power who ended in a nappy? Are you crazy? There's a reason why he ended in a nappy. He ended up in a nappy. Do you know what Nietzsche used to do? He used to run around naked dancing in the garden. Like his sister would have to come out and be like, Nietzsche, put your clothes back on, all right? Come on, let's come in and sit here and all this type of stuff. That's a signal. Is that your prophet? I don't know. Is that romantic enough to be your prophet? Like let's take it easy here. Like it seems like he got this stuff wrong. I'm not sure if he's a hero to base the whole future of the world upon. And Jung sort of saying, look, in order for you as an individual to deal with the chaos of modernity, you're going to have to do this process. You're going to have to sit down there. If you want to be authentic and coherent, you're going to have to understand that you've got this ego. And if I'm going to give you this sort of framework, I'm going to say, right, you've got this ego. And in order for you to reach the sort of highest development stage of your life in the modern world, is that you're going to have to kind of go through this process where you individuate. So you're going to work with yourself. You're going to have to connect to this subconscious mind, and you're going to have to learn to listen to it and integrate with it. And it's going to be this animating soul if you do, and it's going to give you power if you do it. And maybe I could say, maybe that's the left hemisphere. You begin in early life, very right hemisphere like a child, and then your ego, your conscious, linguistic left hemisphere comes online. You begin talking, you become a blatherbrain. You do that for 20, 30 years. It's very procedural and functional. And then you have a midlife crisis where that all breaks down and you need to reintegrate it and get your animating ego, animating right brain to come back online and be like, hey, I've been here all along. This type of thing. That's a really good thesis, because you see this quite a lot. And then the sort of thesis of mental health and the thesis of psychology and the thesis of all this type of stuff, it's all undermined, because it's all suggesting that, well, at the root of it is this craving for religious experience. This craving for religious experience is literally a craving for, I want something inside of me that animates me that is not me. I don't want my ego to be doing this anymore. I want to connect with something higher than myself, some type of power. I want my emotions to guide me. I want to trust something inside of myself. And this is how you achieve it. It's a beautiful idea. Very, very powerful idea. Now, the counterpoint, the Nietzschean take, the Nietzschean war against this, of course, now I've oiled up Jung and I've prepared him, I've like spanked his ass and I've been like, all right, get in there, now we're going to have Nietzsche, we're going to oil up Nietzsche and get him ready and wrestle him. This is going to be weird. Oil up that mustache of him and get him ready and give him a spank and send him in there. Nietzsche, this is a really damning perspective on Nietzsche, and a great perspective. I love Jung's take, and I think power to him. I think everybody should chew on this stuff and really, really think about what's going on here. But I do see some problems, and I do see Nietzsche having a very compelling a very compelling statement as well. And I think the thing that kind of hooks this together for Nietzsche the most is that I actually believe that Nietzsche's promises, worries, and predictions came more true than most of Jung's. Jung's is not, like, you can't dismiss all of Jung. Definitely you shouldn't do that. But you can't dismiss all of Nietzsche as well. And maybe even most of Nietzsche stands with a lot more solid foundations than, shall we say, most of Jung. So we'll get into that now. Now, Nietzsche suggests that if you want to learn to think, if you want to learn to be a great person, if you want to individuate, if you want to develop your mind, if you want to go through the education system properly, if you want to draw out your inherent power, you need to go through a process of learning to see first, then you learn to think, and then you learn to communicate. Now, Nietzsche's basing this off his own ability to actually engage with the world. And what's actually so fascinating about this is that this process itself is implicitly anti-ego. It implies humility. Because what most people do, egotistically, is that they judge, they assert, they blather, they chatter about what they think about the world. I have an opinion about the world and all this type of stuff. Whereas, of course, the most manly and correct perspective, the right hemisphere being more wired for testosterone, is more suitable for the silent hunter, the hunter who's out observing the world and doesn't take boyish, uncontrolled, untamed actions and just launches himself upon the world. Instead, the hunter yields himself, holds himself, calms himself down, and observes and studies. And he notices the animal, and he empathizes with the animal. He feels the animal's vibe. And then when he understands, he thinks and he reasons. And when he sees the right opportunity, when he notices and deducts and sees the right opportunity, then he expresses, then he acts, then he creates, then he launches himself upon the world. And so implicitly, his ability to humble himself and get into observation mode is key towards developing yourself. And Nietzsche's assertion of this actually comes from his ability to do this. He is an incredibly observant thinker. He's really, really good at perceiving this. I think he's actually much better than Jung at this particularly. And he's also more philosophically skilled and better understanding how to do philosophy and how to think and how to reason. Most people are terrible at this. So what Nietzsche is trying to do, what you should do when you're trying to understand and to think, you should be dropping your preconceptions, your ideology, your notions, and you should become an astute student. You should become an astute observer, and you should sit there like the hunter in the forest and watch and observe the world for what it is. And then when you start to see patterns and you notice things about the world, you're like a meditator. You don't have any opinions at all. You're fully empirically studying the world, and then you can begin to grab onto some of these these patterns and explore them and test them and hammer away at them, hammer at these what we call first principles or axioms, hammer away at them, chop, 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 what the hell am I talking about? Hammer away at them until they're firm, and then you can begin to reason from them. You can begin to, this is what thinking is, you can begin to logically deduce. Once you have an axiom, logic works where you have an axiom and then you follow procedural and logical thinking from there, which leads you to a conclusion, and then you express the conclusion. That's the whole idea. That's how you think and communicate properly. You learn to observe, you learn to shut up, actually observe the world, find axiomatic principles, reason from those principles, articulate a hypothesis, and present it to the world, express it to the world. There's a very, very simple and elegant way of doing things. It's super hard though. Nietzsche was fantastic at it. This is the type of stuff that allows you to sit in maybe a world that's full of cope and delusion and bad ideas, and you can sit down and you can churn through all the bad ideas, observe the world around you without ideology, without the zeitgeist of your time getting in the way, and see things that are going on and study them and then build ideas on top of them. And this allows you to make profound predictions about the world, and this also allows you to see things 10 years ahead of your time, be like exceptionally perceptive for your age. And this is exactly what Nietzsche was. Nietzsche was clearly correct at this because Nietzsche's foresight was incredible. Nietzsche predicted things that are happening today that he predicted them 150 years ago, stuff that far extends anything that Jung sort of predicted. He is so astute with this, and the reason why he was so good at this is because of his ability to perceive axioms. And one of these was about this idea of what is truly this thing, this subconscious mind, this supercomputer. What is truly driving this? What's truly driving us is really what you could sort of talk about. And his idea was that life, or you could even say maybe life force, this is really the thing that is behind everything. This is really the thing that is fundamental. This is anchored. This is the real thing that we should be focusing on. And the whole differentiation between what you think and how you conduct in the world, and how valuable you even are to the world and how valuable you are to the society, is all down to how much life force you have. And basically it's almost like a video game character. Like you have a sort of life force bar, and if your life force bar is low, you're just going to be an annoying person to be around. But if your life force bar is high, you'll be good to be around. And so the sort of quantity and the thing that lives inside your, you could say, subconscious mind, or that supercomputer mind of yours, this energy that comes out of that is really the most important thing. How much energy do you have packed away in this? How much energy exists within your body? How much electrical charge exists within your body? How much of a fireball are you as a person? How animated are you? How much of a soul do you have? It's not really about like where is your soul, but it's more of a question about like how much fire and energy and fury is coming out of your soul. And the reason why this is because when you're high charge, which basically means you'll have a lot of passions, you won't just be lustful. You'll have your lust will be insane. You won't just be prideful. You'll be ambitious. You'll want to like conquer the world so people remember your name. And this is good. You'll be greedy in the sense that you want to make your dreams happen, because your dreams will save the world in some type of sense. And this is a very naturally good thing. It's a barbaristic perspective, but very, very naturally good. And people with a high force of charge become creative and very, very naturally produce things that we associate as good. People will cope with all sorts of stuff like greed and high energy and ambition, and all these things are bad. But when you go to ancient Rome or ancient Greece and you see the beautiful architecture constructed by a people with high charge, you will naturally, say that's good, even though you'll disrespect the fact that, of course, that had to come from people who were just insane with ambition and self-interest and fireballs of energy. The Greeks themselves, Nietzsche saw the Greeks themselves as like a highly charged people, a people with a disgusting amount of charge. They were kind of crazy, and the whole modus operandi between them is that they were competing with their neighbor. Them and their neighbors, it wasn't like love your neighbor that we understand from Christianity. It was like, oh my God, and there's my neighbor, I have to outcompete him somehow. They would wrestle all the time. They'd have all types of ways of competing, fighting. Everything was about competition, about beating your neighbor. There's this sort of like terror within the Greece, because like everybody was so full of charge and aggression and violence that you're almost as afraid of your neighbors as you were of like outsiders and people from outside of it. The Greeks were like in among themselves, always battering and fighting each other. They were were just it was like a vibrating nuclear bomb just waiting to go off the entire population. And this is a really fertile and powerful place to be, because this produced Greek culture, which nowadays we even look back with reverence. It's like, oh, how did they come up with all those beautiful statues and those profound myths? How did all that stuff pour out of them? Well, of course, it poured out of them because these were people who were full of powerful charge. They had a very, very coherent and powerful way of orientating themselves, a very, very much beautiful way of orientating themselves. The Romans the same. How did they explode into the Roman Empire like a pretty big deal? Because they were full of charge. And what happens is when this charge weakens, when this charge drops, when your life force drops, what happens is you start to turn into something kind of uglier, something bad, something is not evil, but something just kind of like pathetic and decrepit, something weak and something resentful. Like we talked about the whole communist thing early on, that sort of thing where you begin to drop in power and you're not able to create for yourself and not able to build a reality for yourself. You don't believe in yourself. You can't become creative. You're maybe as a group you're even weak as well. And what happens is then the resentment boils up, the envy boils up. And so because your charge is low and you don't feel that you can kind of create anything, the only way you can really rise your charge is by getting jealous, by getting envious, by getting suspicious of these type of things that are doing well. And Nietzsche would sort of say that this whole thing, it sounds simple, but it is axiomatically true. The most important thing for us to focus on is keeping the charge of ourselves and the people, the tribe we live within, as high as possible, because this is what creates what we understand as the good and the beautiful and the true, which is interesting, because I always thought that the way that this should work is that we should sit around and reason. We should discuss the right ideas. We should organize the correct compendium of cope in order for us to compendium of cope. In order for us to get things right, we need to organize the correct architecture of Coke. We need to talk about the correct interpretation of the Bible or Christianity, or we need to talk about the correct interpretation of Platonism, or we need to even talk about the correct way to see Nietzsche and all this type of stuff. We need to get our ideas straight, and then all that will sort out. But it doesn't really matter. If you're full of high charge, you can be a Muslim with a Quran, and maybe it's all just delusion and nonsense, right? But because you're full of charge, you're a force of power, and you'll say, oh, this is Allah that's driving me. And then you will succeed because you're full of charge. And then you might say to yourself, that was Islam that did that for me. Maybe it was, but what if it was just a high charge that you had? And then when you burn out, you can have Islam, but Islam doesn't work quite the same as it did before. Same with Christianity. Christianity, if you're full of charge, if you're a people full of energy, you can take Christianity like the Germans did after they conquered the Roman Empire. They take Christianity and they baptize the world. They baptize Europe with Christianity, and they take it and they interpret it and turn it into a warrior religion that kind of carries them around. But of course, then later on, like nowadays, where people are way lower in their charge, Christianity is hardly a warrior religion anymore. It's a sort of gentle religion of love thy neighbor, and it's the religion of globalization in some type of sense. And this is absolutely fascinating, because there's this reality where wherever the charge is inside of people determines what the ideology is going to be able to do, suggesting that the ideology, the nogginism, the nonsense is useless. It's not. There's nothing to it. It's just a moot point in some type of sense. It's just the churning blather of our rationalizing left hemisphere going through its processes and all this. But really, the true focus should be on the charge. And if we are to then reason from axiomatic principles, the correct worldview, the correct perspective, correctly understood, would be to say, well, how do we build a way of thinking about the world? You could say a dutiful way of thinking about the world. How do we ritualize behaviors that increase our charge? Like, instead of all going to church, why don't we all go to the gym? Instead of all eating the sacred bread, why don't we all eat sacred, healthy diets? Instead of doing all these behaviors that cause us to ruin our charge, maybe by fasting or praying and stuff like this, why don't we focus on behaviors that increase our charge, empower us, rise our spirits up, or something like this? Instead of reading about stories that make us feel guilt and shame, such as things like killing people in the crucifixion and stuff like this, why don't we read stories about empowering us, like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and all this stuff? And I know that's super jarring, and I don't mean to be just banging on Christianity. These are just sort of Nietzsche's perspectives. This is applicable to all religions you can think about the world, or even all modern ideologies. Why are we focusing on things that are guilt orientated, why are we focusing on ideology instead of focusing on creating that charge? What creates that charge? Health, wealth, health, wealth, rituals of power, rituals of engagement of the body, rituals of persuading the body, rituals of putting the body in good shape. And this creates good charge, creativity, and this actually creates a better world. And this is what's so fascinating about this, is that this is actually quite nakedly true. Like, you see this with, for example, in the field of psychology. If someone's coming in and they might have, as you could say with Jung and stuff like that, they might be having psychosis or depression or something like this. They might be going through a crisis, if you will. And if you were a staunch Jungian, an ideologue in that type of sense, and you sit down with these people, you might try to force this whole idea of let's read your dreams and get you to talk to this right hemisphere and all this type of stuff and talk to your soul. And, there's maybe something to that, but you'll find, and I have plenty of experience with this, that the vast majority of people don't need to get actually caught up in a 10-year work with a therapist where they read through their dreams and all this type of stuff and go in these like long, convoluted circles that don't get them anywhere. Most people need to stop smoking weed, stop drinking Coca-Cola, stop eating pizza, and start eating cleaner food, start sorting their physiology out, go to the gym, learn a combat sport, get more fresh air, and go into nature. They need to increase their charge. This is usually the problem with most people. And no, this isn't even some kind of wacky theory either. There's very clear neuroscience on this type of stuff. For example, with the gut, the SSRIs is the chemical that most people give when you have depression. It's a drug, Now, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that's what that is. That's designed to help you deal with depression. It fixes your serotonin levels in your brain. But of course, if you eat a clean diet that's healthy for your gut bacteria produces 95% of your serotonin. And so if you want to fix your charge, like, the neurochemistry is definitely going to affect your charge, well, correct your diet. There's project number one, this type of thing. And it sounds too reductive. People are like, no, I don't want that. I want it to be complicated. I want it to allow me to flatter my coping, rationalizing, delusional mind. I want that to be center stage because that's what I understand, because I'm a neurotic stuck in my head and I want it to be that way. And it offends me that you try and make stuff this simple. But of course, it doesn't matter what offends you or not. We're trying to talk about reality here. And this is about going down to principles and noticing what's going on. And it's very, very clear that, if you're eating a clean diet that is probiotic, gets your gut bacteria firing up and all this, you're going to have just more chemistry to try overcome this depression. That's going to be easier for you to make it happy. Maybe there's more to it. I'm sure there is. I'm sure it's a holistic picture. But you have to start getting down to these principles. You have to say to yourself, well, wait a second. If I'm trying to fix someone, do I really need to sit down there and smash them through 14 volumes of Carl Jung that's all just like elaborate conceptual rationalizations and try to get them to sit down and read through their dreams and all these type of things to tell them that they're trying, the delusions they're having are trying to talk to something, when there's even studies going out that people with candida, people with fungus infections, people with bad probiotic things are more prone to schizophrenia than other people. These type of things. Why aren't we talking about this type of stuff? Well, of course, because that type of stuff usually takes only a month to fix you, whereas a long therapeutic process can take years and years of paying a therapist in order to do this. It's very, very fascinating how that type of stuff works. And of course, this is a really, really, really serious problem, because this whole idea of fixing the charge and empowering the charge also has to flatter things like ambition and will and creativity. And these things are things that often people who get into therapy and work in psychology don't have, because if they did, they wouldn't be so concerned about something like operating as the priestly type. They wouldn't do that. The priestly type is usually uniquely reserved for people who are low charge, people who are stuck neurotically in their heads. Instead, these people would go along and they would go out into the business world, they go out into the athletics world, they go out into the fighting world, they go out into the creative world. They're trying to make stuff, they try to do stuff, because if you're high charge, you're going to be tortured by the idea of sitting around blathering for decades with people not getting them anywhere. You'd be like, I want to create life, I want to create art. You would understand instinctively, you would say, if I create a great work of art, it's going to save more lives and inspire more people than sitting for 20 years as a therapist. If I want to inspire people, why don't I become an athlete or something like that and do things that no one has ever done before? That will inspire people, and this type of thing. These are very, very interesting and difficult problems that we have, and people can't confront them in these type of realms because it's so shocking to their sensibilities. It offends their, identity. It offends this whole construction of a mind that they've created and all this type of stuff. And the reality is that Nietzsche's talking about this idea of this high charge, this will to power, this electricity, this energy, this animating force as fundamentally good. And all these desires inside of us, these ambitions, they're fundamentally good as well. And we should learn to almost be led by them. It's like these little pagan gods pushing us around in some type of sense. Just like the Muslims of the past or the Christians of the past, they would have that lust, and that lust would come out of them as a representation, a spiritualized version that allows them to coherently understand what it is. You'd have your lust would come out, and the Muslim would understand that as Allah's offer for you to have a harem if you are a good enough warrior for Allah. The Christian, the same thing. The Christians offered that you get a beautiful wife if you are subservient to God and Christ. And all these type of ideas pour out of it. But Nietzsche is asking us to entertain, you could say, a more mature and scientific and honest interpretation of our spiritual emotions. He's not saying deny them and become a primal grug at all. He's saying, why don't you just understand them what they are and order these passions in the correct way? Connect with your lust and say, well, what my lust wants is a very profound experience of fertility and wants to be creative. And maybe I should just understand that for what it is, nakedly say what it is. Like, if we're going to be honest with ourselves and we dive down to this type of stuff, that's what it is. That's what's driving us. It's not this blather about like the ideology about how sexual relationship works. It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with what the actual passion says itself, and we should listen to that. No, we don't have to surrender to it, but we should be honest about what it wants. You should think about what it wants. Think about why life is driving this. Why does life want a man to procreate with lots of women? Because life would understand that most men don't procreate at all in nature. Most men die, and the best men have lots of girlfriends. This is also what the data says as well, and that's how things worked back then, and you should engage with nature in this type of way and understand nature's hierarchical way of working and all this type of stuff. And then your dreams and your ambitions, that part of your mind that thinks about creating stuff and changing the world and having your own ideas and building a whole new way of seeing things and building a whole new empire. These visions, these dreams, there's nothing wrong with this as well. This is life operating through you. This is you. The only reason you have these problems where you're tortured, where all your friends are watching fucking sports and all your friends are consuming crap food and sitting around and complaining and whining about the way that the famous people don't respect them and all this type of stuff. The reason why you're sitting there during this conversation being tortured, trying to scratch your fucking eyes out because this is so mundane, is because these people around you have low charge, whereas you've been blessed with a high charge. You just haven't disciplined yourself enough to manifest these dreams in a profound way. And so in order for you to fully do what is right, because you're the one who saves the world, your high charge, your energy, that's the thing that saves the world. It's your job to try to release that creative energy to the highest level. You have to take the world on. You have to fight against the entropy of the world, the low chargers, the low will to power people, the people who are resentful and suck, the people who are sort of like consumerists and all that. You have to fight against that. You have to fight against these mistakes and create this stuff in your reality for you. And this is a really, really, really profound thing that speaks very, very deep down to ambitious people, because this is fundamentally always the challenge. You feel the world around you, the herd around you is very much locked into all these thinking patterns and ways of interpreting themselves that are disempowering, that fundamentally reduce your charge. You see it in the religious people where you're like, I want to create stuff, I want to go and embrace my will and express myself, and they'll always have this inhibiting no, you should go to church instead. And then it's just like dampen the creative spirit. You should go to church instead. You should follow this ideology instead. You should give in to all this stuff instead. There's this constant need, this constant desire to dampen the will of the young creative energy. And then the same with the consumers. It's the same sort of energy where you're sitting around with a load of people watching sports and you're like, hey, let's go play sports. Let's become the athletes that we watch. And it's like, no, that's too much effort. That's not cool. Let's sit around and chill. Why don't you relax and all this type of stuff? The low chargers are trying to reduce your charge. They're trying to pull you down. They're trying to grapple you down. And what Nietzsche would sort of suggest, I'd imagine, is that Jung's Red Book, Jung's experience of going crazy, was actually a signal of Jung's his charge, his will to power, his energetic, animating power bursting out of him. But he failed to do it properly. Now, what you could look at with the Red Book is certainly an experience of madness. And what happens when you are full of charge, you're an electric, crazy, ambitious, animated madman. And what happens is that you become like an origin point. You become an original. You become a first creator. And you're going to offend all the ideologies of the past. You're going to offend the society around you. You're going to create something new, and it's going to be mind-blowingly weird, and people won't accept it. And then over 20 years later, people will be like, oh, what a genius. Nietzsche was certainly like that. Jung was certainly like that. And what you could look at the Red Book as is that Jung was receiving that experience of the dreaming mind, the animated charge, life force bursting through him, switching on all his cognitive facilities, his ambition, his passions, his dreaming mind. It all got switched on, turned up to 11, and it burst out of him. And it gave him the sacred artistic muse experience. That's what happened to Jung. Just like it happened to Nietzsche. Nietzsche was swallowed up by Zarathustra, and he wrote Zarathustra in 10 days. He flashed out Zarathustra, just ripped inside of him and gave him this sacred work. And Nietzsche would look at Zarathustra as something like very, very coherent, very, very well put together and readable and containing plenty of things, and sort of has a sort of orchestration and coherency to it. And the Red Book was the same situation with Jung. Jung was about to receive this sort of visual baptism of the fire of the Red Book, whatever that type of meant, and it was his opportunity to do this. And Jung was actually super inspired by Zarathustra at the time. But the problem with Jung is that Jung was in some sense unable to do precisely what he talked about. He was unable to humble his ego and embrace the sort of artistic role that he had. He was unable to embrace the creator. He was unable to put himself aside, his intellectualism aside, and actually integrate fully what he was trying to do. Jung in the Red Book had an opportunity perhaps to create something at the scale of Zarathustra, at the scale of William Blake, at the scale of Paradise Lost. He had this opportunity to create a great, profound work. He could have painted it out and made sort of some type of William Blake style comic book thing or something like this, or he could have edited it down. But actually what's interesting is that you see when you read the Red Book this sort of clashing of his blathering, intellectualizing, rationalist, nogginist mind, battering and clashing against the visual, mythopoetic, energetic part of himself, and he's unable to sort of fight between the two of them. The Red Book is actually a little bit unreadable because it smashes between, you could say, explosive visual coherency and then these big long pages of rationalization and explanation and expedition of what this stuff means. And it's Jung in some sense is making a mistake of not doing what an artist should do. Now he says himself that his goal was not necessarily to make this a work of art and all this type of stuff, but it doesn't really matter what his ego says he was trying to do, what he thought he should have done. His job perhaps was actually to give birth to an original creative point. He had this ability to have this big visual experience, and maybe he should have actually taken the time to embrace his true identity as a creative, as an artist, and represent these ideas fully for what they were. And instead what you get in the Red Book is almost in some sense a draft of something that could have been, that never happened, because Jung either didn't embrace his charge because he had all this, you could say, guilt and intellectualization, and he had been imprisoned within the conceptual world of Kant and Cope and all this type of stuff, the ideological world of Cope that had actually hidden him back, held him back, and didn't allow him to release himself upon this job and actually become a full-on creative first principle and establish something quite profound. He was too stuck in his head to make it art, is basically what I'm saying. He was too stuck in his head to surrender and give into this charge, because he had all Christian guilt and Christian morality and philosophical guilt and psychological cope and intellectualism and nogginism. It actually it damaged his ability to do that job. And so even though he made it out for himself, he made it out coherent and all this type of stuff, he might have actually failed to achieve something that could have been necessary. And it's why maybe his impact is not quite as, you could say, resonant as Nietzsche's. Nietzsche's is kind of shocking in its profoundness and the perceptive and colorful depth of an awful lot of what Nietzsche talks about, whereas Jung went through the Red Book, and then his real contribution was the intellectualizations that came after that. And it's not taken seriously. Like, as much as we like Jung, most people don't take him seriously. I'm always getting, I talk to people who are, psychologists or scientists and all this, and they always basically dismiss me because I'm associated as a sort of Jungian. And they're like, no, Jung is just cope. It's just nonsense. It's just bullcrap, And really that's because he went through the Red Book experience and he tried to articulate out of it, you could say, a load of scientific concepts. It was like he was trying to act, to be like, please accept me, science. Please, I'm trying to to put this as a coherent and planned, ordered, scientific thing to do. And all right, power to him. There's definitely something to it, but it's very floozy. It's very loose. It's he tried to systematize something that maybe wasn't ready. Like we didn't have. Maybe we needed neuroscience of the hemispheres in order to make this stuff coherent. And now the only thing that Jung could be useful for is that you'll salvage out of Jung's ideas something new and all this type of stuff. The real thing that Jung needed to do, like maybe the thing that would have allowed Jung to penetrate through all that type of stuff would be to fully embrace that role as like, I am an artist, I am a producer of art. This is precisely what his unconscious even said. This is art, my dear. This eruption of creativity that's coming out of you. And he might have been able to establish a great book like Paradise Lost, maybe a great work like Homer, this foundational fountain of creativity that would have provided it with us a sort of coherent myth to explore the future. But he failed to do that. And because he failed to do that, we have sort of lost. Whereas Zarathustra stands and Nietzsche's works stand as something that was just far more shocking. Nietzsche was just far more ignorant and far more stubborn and just sort of went for it. He went all in. And his work has a creative fertility to it that is very, very easy to grasp upon and very, very first principle and axiomatic and very, very creative in this type of way. And so maybe you could look at Jung's mistake as that type of thing. And the danger of Jung is that it leads towards you falling for the same problem. It leads towards you getting lost in intellectualization and symbol studying instead of symbol producing, instead of creative producing, instead of surrendering to the life charge and allowing that to fill you up, instead of you obsessing about how do I persuade and create a life charge within me so that it fills me up and occupies my dreams, and then fully give myself over to that so that I can produce something. And just sort of in a very simple sense, having faith that if I create these new visions, these new forms, these new ideas, the true artistic work, then all of this stuff will get sorted out by itself. There's no idea about creating an ideological religion or a coherent way to understand psychology. Just let the creativity happen, and a lot of this stuff will happen quite naturally in this type of way. Don't inhibit yourself. Let yourself go. Let the creativity out, and a lot of this stuff will work. But no, instead what we have is we have people stuck in the head. We have people stuck in our heads, stuck in our noggin still. And maybe Jung is this sort of problem with this. He's Kantian, he's Platonic in these type of ways. Jung, Plato, Christianity, modern psychology, it's all cool. Jung has lots of really cool ideas. I definitely, we don't want to dismiss them, but maybe it's still stuck in that paradigm of intellectualization, of nogginism, whereas Nietzsche's whole flip of the whole thing is that physiology is the reality. Where does the electrical charge come from? It comes from the body. The body must be persuaded, as he says. We must put ourselves through stress. We must traumatize ourselves. We must build up power. We must build up a nexus of force. We must evoke in our spirits or find within our spirits that will towards competition. We must fight and learn to fight each other, learn to attack each other, to create violent, conflicting energies inside of ourselves. We must create that energy foundationally. And once we have that competitive, explosive charge living within us, all that intellectualization stuff, it becomes a little bit irrelevant. You turn into a Spartan, you turn into a Roman, and you don't care about talk, you don't care about chatter, you don't care about orchestrating out elaborate conceptual left hemispheric schemes. You don't care about that type of stuff because that stuff's not creative art. It's not civilization building. It's not entertaining. It's not fun. It's just cope. It's all just cope. You don't want it anymore. We want to get that stuff out of the way. The thing that we need is charge. When there's charge, when there's energy, and when there's will to power, life force, animation inside of a people, the people are interesting. The people are moved. And even in an individual or a people, it's better. But now when it's all just like rationalizations and nonsense and nogginism, it's not fun, it's boring, it's frigid, it's stiff, it's dying, it's a signal of death in and of itself. Nietzsche went on to say that Plato and Socrates were the beginning signal of the Greeks' explosive energy dying, because they moved from being a people who were mythological, Homeric, energetic, fireball-like, to people who were neurotic, rationalizing, like Plato. Exactly what did Plato do? He studied the archetypes in Greek mythology and tried to come up with this idea of how do you create a new mythology and rationally put together a new mythology that will be able to organize society in a more noble and moral way. Plato was a rationalizer. Plato was an intellectual coper who came after the golden age and the fireball age of the Greeks. And precisely, if you want to create a golden age, you don't start with the rationalizations that happen at the end. You start with the energy and causes that happened at the start. This is what Nietzsche saw, that no one else seems to see. And so our situation, our problem, where we're like like lost in the culture crisis and the meaning crisis and all that is because we are weak physiologically, because we are weak in spirit, because we don't have a will to competition, because we're stuck in the marring conceptual world of cope. Like meme analysis says, you've got this big web of concepts and blather that are sucking your libido up into it, and you're getting trapped in all these memes and ideologies in the internet instead of living a life in the body, living a energized life that is free and actually based on the experience and the charge of the body. And if you wanted to orchestrate out an ideology or a worldview or a way of doing things, you would return to this first principle, start on this first principle, understand this first principle, and then build everything upon that. And maybe Jung's stuff could come in and be integrated into that. I certainly believe that is possible. I don't think Jung is useless. I don't think Jung should be in any way dismissed. But I'm not sure if Jung is holistic enough. I think Jung actually fundamentally suffers from this because the Jungians themselves have the specific trait of being neurotic, stuck in their heads, lost in an abstraction of symbols, lost, and they're not a creative first principle. They're usually up reorganizing, blathering about jargon, and they're not taken seriously. They're not good at being scientific. They're not good at being critical, and they're often sort of messianic in their worship of Jung's concepts, unable to establish their own concepts, and completely sort of low thumos, psychedelic addicted, weed smoking, low energy, low charge people, because they have no worldview where they're pressured to say, you need to build your energy up, you need to build your body up, you need to build your compelling power up, you need to build ambition up. They have no way of saying this type of stuff. The ideology as it's manifest is just not good. Now, it's not like the Nietzscheans can ever sometimes be better. You often get Nietzscheans that are like, there is no morality. I'm just going to, I'm going to set up a polyamory brothel here and all this type of stuff. That is my will to power. Like, that's obviously silly as well. But the Nietzscheans, I meet an awful lot more Nietzscheans who have their head on straight, who are more in the body, who are more instinctive, because I think it's because Nietzsche empowers ambition. I think Nietzsche suggests that it's okay to want to create stuff. It's okay to want to create a reality around yourself. He, in some sense, flatters and rewards the masculine instincts of wanting to build, wanting to be a first principle, wanting to be a creator. He does that better than Jung, and for that reason, he is more solid to build a foundation upon, because we want that creative spirit to flourish. We want the artist to be able to release their energy. We don't want the artist to be like Jung, where they get caught up reading the symbols that they're trying to interpret through and rationalizing what's going on. We don't really care what it means. We want to feel the energy of it as it's released. That's really the true thing that we're looking for. I don't want to be a part of a society that figures it all out. You don't want that. You might think you do, but you don't. There's no joy in that. That's death. That's when you're studying the movie after it has happened. You want to be experiencing the thing. You want the joy of it going on as it happens, this type of thing. And this is the sort of surrender that we're talking about. And so the axiomatic foundation that you could build a civilization upon, or build an individual upon, is actually about getting that charge in place. If that charge is not in place, if the person is not nakedly honoring their instincts and going about trying to create a reality for themselves, building a life around themselves, and listening to their instincts and actually trusting them and ambitiously trying to make them happen, there is no point in almost anything else. Everything else becomes irrelevant. Everything else becomes pointless, because it's just a low energy person who is grabbing onto maybe like a Jungian ideology that is just cope. It just turns into cope. It turns into a failure. It's not useful. It doesn't do anything. It just turns into actually a labyrinth of thoughts that don't go anywhere. It's a waste of time. It's nogginism. It's delusion. It's in the way. And so what I'm getting at is that if I am to surrender my higher thinking and finally embrace an ideology that frees me from cognition, frees me from metacognition, frees me from hesitation, frees me from rock sitting and pondering, frees me from philosophy, frees me from this nogginist nonsense. I need something. I need to believe that what I'm engaging in is something that is real. And in some sense, I think this is why Nietzsche is such a brilliant thinker. And people miss this so much. They often say stuff, for example, that Nietzsche is contradictory. It's complete bullshit. He's not. He's very coherent, almost all the time he's coherent. It's just that he's super shocking and super against most people's sensibilities, so they have to cope by being like, oh, Nietzsche, contradictory, all these type of things. No, Nietzsche was very, very coherent. He was very axiomatic. He presents very straightforward, well put together first principles, like I said, and he consistently talks about them, and most of his ideas are built upon these. And when you have these in place, it becomes quite easy to understand an awful lot what he's saying. He's not mysterious. mysterious. He's very, very straightforward with this type of stuff. And I think the key aspect of this is that his understanding, his true understanding of what it means to be scientific, what it means to be creative, what it means to be to do philosophy and construct what science means, which is knowledge, which is a correct worldview. Nietzsche says that science is nature represented as concepts, represented as abstractions. What you should be doing, as I said at the very start, is you should be observing the world and seeing reality, nature, without any judgment, without any ideology that you've inherited down from your tradition or your society or whatever it is, and instead see, look, observe, study. You see these patterns, and then you grab these patterns and you represent them as ideas, as concepts. Nietzsche proposed, for example, master morality and slave morality. He says that he is observing these natural processes happening in society, ignoring the book cope, ignoring the rationality, ignoring the nogginism, and he's looking at all these patterns that are happening in society, in social relations, and he's conceptualizing this as master morality and slave morality and offering it to us as a concept, as a scientific concept, a concept that we can add to our body of knowledge. He suggests the same thing about, for example, the will to power, or the energy, whatever it is. He's suggesting it's like, this is the axiom here you go, take a look at this type of stuff. And he's presenting this stuff all the time. He's asking you to look at this stuff and add it to our body of knowledge, because if we do this, this becomes true. And ultimately, he says that the goal is that we all gather together and find enough of these and get serious enough about our perspective that we actually focus on our goal, to understand finally that our goal is that we want to create a beautiful society like ancient Greece, like Rome, like the West. We want a renaissance. We want that stuff to happen. But the problem is that we can't decide beforehand, rationalism and being nice to people. We can't decide that that's how that happens if it's not true. We have to go to causes. We have to go to what creates this stuff on first principle and go there. And Nietzsche says when you observe, it's never, were you nice enough to your neighbor and then a renaissance happens next week. That's never what happens. It's usually the aggressive, creative, competitive, charged energy of people who had been through maybe an extreme period of stress that creates this sort of fireball of energy within them. And then these people compete, and then out of that comes a fertile, profound, and powerful culture. And this is ultimately what we're trying to do. And the reason why we are in such a terrible state in the West now is because of all these years, because of this power of civilization, first of all, but all these years of, you could say, book cope and rewarding through philosophy and Christianity and now psychology of rationalism and book cope, is that we've developed into intellectual neurotic nogginists, and we've almost completely severed our ability to get in touch with our instincts, to the parody now that we go into psychologists where we want to fix our minds, and of course they bullshit us, aren't able to do it, and prescribe us fucking drugs, which is basically chemicals to alleviate the body of any will, just turn the body off and this type of thing. This is what it's come to because it's such a disaster. It's so badly done. And basically what has happened is that this collection of errors and mistakes, this tumbling problem of errors and mistakes, this unawareness of the reality of the charge, and this inability to organize ourselves and say, all right, how do we get scientific about this? How do we focus on a true knowledge and worldview and perspective so that we can create these beautiful renaissances, this beautiful Roman society, this beautiful Greek society, this beautiful Western society with all this beautiful cathedrals and all this? How do we make this stuff happen? Well, the way we make this stuff happen is we figure out what causes it. We figure out how to create this charge. And if we don't do this, it's almost like the opposite is going to happen. We're going to have people who deny this for long enough that it's going to turn into something even worse than this. And this is, of course, his prophecy of the last man. He suggests that he saw around him the way the people were thinking, the way the people were approaching this stuff, the amount of denial that was going on about what happens underneath the neck, that we're going to lead to a point where you're going to have an arrogant, the individual in general is going to be an arrogant, selfish, low-thinking, unambitious, happy guy consumer. Someone who sits there and chomps up the Amazon in order to turn it into soybean fields. Someone who sits there and eats the disgusting fast food meats that require the torturing of animals in order to fulfill his desires because he righteously deserves this. Someone who sits there drinking beer and watching sports. Someone who sees that the entire harvest of humanity in the future was also his belly could get filled, also his pride could get flattered. The last man, the greedy, lazy fuck who is going to claim the earth eat the whole world up, the useless Chewbacca muncher that's going to eat the whole world up, grow swollen and fat like a honeybee that has too much, and then just destroy the world for his will. He's going to fester and take it over and go around and do tourism and go around and consumeristically get all these cool niche products and destroy oceans and on all this type of stuff in order to manifest his desire, his will, his selfishness, flatter himself. And he's going to do this because of his inalienable human rights, because of his divine rights of choice, because the free market rewards his rights, because of all these type of things, because of this equalizing and righteousness that's inbuilt inside of this type of stuff. He's going to deserve all this, and he's going to be a low energy person with low charge, out of shape, sweaty, in a bad place, watching his sports, all this type of stuff, bigoted and ignorant, beer guzzling. And he's going to choose all these type of things because they flatter him, because they suit him. And this is what the individual of the earth is. And this is one type of tragic ending to the world. The world is not going to end in some type of beautiful Renaissance or Roman Empire at the end of it. It's going to end in this decrepit, botched hellhole of lazy people who aren't engaged in actually making the world a enjoyable and beautiful and profound place. And Nietzsche saw this phenomenon as the last man, the culmination of all these forces churning towards and leading us to where we are now. And his proposition is that the way we counteract this is by getting realistic, by getting scientific, by coming down and seeing this correct worldview and saying to ourselves, how do we flip the script? How do we actually make individuals powerful? And of course, he would suggest by creating a profound charge inside of them. How do we do this? Ritualizing behaviors that create charge in people, strengths and powers, having them play sports instead of watch sports, having them regulate their diets instead of saying, oh, I'll just leave it up to you to choose. You can eat whatever you want to eat. That's this silly, idiotic behavior that leaves people unhealthy and botched and fat, especially when modern marketing is allowed to brainwash them and all these type of things. Instead, Nietzsche would suggest that we need to focus on creating as much charge inside individuals as we can, because then society as a whole will gravitate up to a higher charge. And out of this, if we're so lucky, might come an Ubermensch, something that is a step beyond merely where we're at now, someone who's so charged they could lead us forward and take us to the next level, take us to the next step. And this is exactly what his prophecy was. And what's so interesting is that this very simple axiomatic prophecy came true. More than anything anybody else I've ever seen talk about, he was just right on this. It just happened. And this is the core problem. This is the thing that's happening. This is the thing that's going on. It's not about anything else other than this. This is the big problem. The big problem. How do you deal with consumerism? How do you deal with selfishness, righteous consumerism, and the consumption and undramatic destruction of the world, where consumerist attitudes are going to pull apart all our societies, churn up all our past cultures, churn up all the forests, all the world, in order to turn it into wheat fields and shopping malls? How do we stop this from consuming everything and destroying it all? And that's the big question, and that's the big challenge. And because we've been in such a state of denial, we still have not answered this. And this is the problem. And of course, your problem as an individual growing up into this is that you're basically a victim of consumerism. Your problems are not so much so that you're fighting dragons and all this type of stuff. You're fighting the dragons in your belly, the desire to eat the pizza and watch the sport and lull yourself into a state of low energy, instead of your ability to crush that out of you and ascend to a position of higher energy, become creative, become fertile, become powerful, and therefore make the great art, the great culture, and the great civilization for the future. That's your individuation job. And it's an awful lot less than you sitting around wanking about, talking about your dreams and all this. It's about you actually getting the real work done that's to do with the whole existential problem of mankind. Maybe you can start doing that if you so wish. So that is that. I'm going to let you decide who is victorious among these two. I think they slogged it out pretty well. Unfortunately, it looks like Nietzsche's after going insane, and he's now in a nappy, and his sister and his coach is trying to pull him back into the corner. Jung has pretty much started talking to himself. He seems like he's still fighting, but like there's no one there. I don't know. Who do you think wins? This has been a parody all unto its end. I guess you'll just have to leave your votes, drop your comments or something like that below. Is that what the YouTubers are supposed to say? And give me a shout. Tell me what you think. Tell me who is victorious and how we win this fight. And so what is implicit in all of this is the thesis of a new way, a new direction coming upon us. This whole idea of what is happening now, and the reason why Jung and Nietzsche found themselves clawing into the darkness of chaos in order to find a new way forward, is because that we are living in a chaotic bottleneck window of history, this sort of 250-year period, this bottleneck is absolutely crazy. Nothing that is happening now is normal. Even something like the internet, only 15 years old, it has absolutely revolutionized society in all sorts of different ways. Stuff like Bitcoin is revolutionizing even things that as old as gold and money and currency, as old as civilization itself. We're having these new perspectives on all this. Social media is absolutely shearing cultural understandings, things like dating and romance and getting together and all this type of stuff. It's getting corrupted by this. Social relations, our ability to interact, our ability to share information, the power of institutions in order to project out a unified perspective and all this. All this stuff is getting churned out. Religions of the past, institutions of the past, all that stuff is getting damaged. People like Nietzsche are suggesting that if we don't adapt to this stuff properly, it's going to create a monstrous generation of last men, hungry, greedy consumers that are going to suckle up the world and turn it into belly fat as opposed to turning it into something incredible like the giving birth to the Ubermensch. Jung, just the same, is suggesting that the whole breakdown of our, you could say, our mythos, our collective perspective and all that is crumbling together and leaving us absent with an inability to interact properly with our minds, putting us in a terrible position that religions of the past gave us very freely an ability to deal with. And so my interest, my big idea, the thing that I am focused on is really continuing on that project and sitting down and getting seriously realistic about how to actually execute on this idea. Basically, how we are supposed to sit down as individuals and adapt to what's going on and use these tools, use the tools of Nietzsche, use the tools of Jung in order to actualize ourselves, to perfect ourselves, to put together plans instead of resorting back to old stiff plans, institutions that have sterilized and dried up, perspectives that died once this whole chaos and crisis of the Industrial Revolution and all these big ideas and the whole age of Aquarius and the whole chaos and the bottleneck of history. How do we adapt to this stuff so we can actually achieve something that is higher, that is ideal? Because the thing that I see that kills most people is the fact that if you want to participate in all these institutions and this society, this unimaginative world, it's ash on your soul. It kills your soul. It dampens you. It dulls you. It makes you feel nothing. You're stuck as a digit within some type of super corporation that its only goal is to somehow like churn up the earth and turn it into some type of commerce tool of some sort. There's no idealism. There's no futurism. There's no thinking big. There's no imagination. There's no leaping forward for the future. And that's really what I'm concerned about. How do you empower you as a person, as an individual, to individuate, to find in yourself the pragmatic power, to create your big strong charge, understand how your mind works, and bring out the most creativity out of yourself as humanly possible. Get a plan that is adapted to this world. This is what humans are great at, adapting to chaos. And we're going through a period of chaos. How do we take all this stuff, adapt, and get ourselves on the straight and narrow so we actually make the most, so actually come out of this on top and dealing with things in a good way? My whole program is about this. Everything I'm trying to build is about this. I'm working on getting films and all this stuff together, all this stuff, creating a new set of stories to pop about this. This is what I'm up to. This is my big plan. This is my big goal. This is me sitting here in the corner being like, right, let's try push this as far as we possibly can. And this is what I'm up to. This is what I'm wrestling against. I'm trying to solve this problem. God knows will I make it, but I feel that I've got the momentum to go somewhere with it anyway. So if you're interested in working with me on my program, link down in the description below. Apply. You will talk to a member of my team and he will give you the rundown on how everything is going to work on that. And if you actually want to work with me as well, you can also pop down into the hiring form. I'll be checking through those and reaching out to people who seem suitable. A lot of that will be suited for people who live in Western Europe, but nonetheless you can check it out if you so wish. And generally speaking, thank you very much for following along. I hope you enjoyed all this type of stuff, and I'll talk to you soon. As I said, those links down in the description below. If you actually want to make this stuff real and actually sit down and talk with me personally and actually work with me personally, this is possible. I'm interested in making this stuff happen. If you actually want to work personally with me and go through this process, pop down below. We can do work on you if you so wish. We can actually build you up and get you in a network of people who are focused on this type of stuff. Or maybe even we can work where I'll hire you and get you working as doing something like video editing, animating, or working as a coach or a consultant or something like that. So pop down below. I will talk to you soon, people. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.